My name is Professor Kathy Liddell, and I direct the Law Faculty Centre for Law, Medicine and Life Sciences here in Cambridge. On behalf of our centre and the Cambridge Festival, I am delighted to welcome you to the 2025 Baron de Lancey Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Kimberly Krawiec. Kimberly is a distinguished lawyer from the University of Virginia, and her lecture is going to be titled Repugnant Transaction and Taboo Trades. In this, she's going to be discussing the moral boundaries of markets and the ethical dilemmas that arise when we allow and prohibit trades involving human bodies and body parts. Before we get to tonight's main event, let me just take a few moments to introduce the Baron de Lancey Lecture Series. We are very grateful that the lecture series is supported by the university's Baron de Lancey Fund for Medical Law Research and Teaching. The fund was established by a foundation in Jersey in 1970 in memory of the extraordinary Baron de Lancey. The Baron was a doctor, a lawyer, and a financier, amongst other achievements. And we're delighted that two trustees of the foundation are here with us tonight, Dr. Charlotte Ritter and Dr. Bas van Alverkerk. Dr. Ritter is in fact a descendant of the Baron, and their daughter studied here in Cambridge, extending a valued connection. Following in the Baron's footsteps, the lecture series has a long history of distinguished interdisciplinary speakers, and we're going to be continuing that tradition tonight. Professor Kimberly Krawiec holds the Charles O. Gregory Professorship of Law at the University of Virginia. She's written extensively about markets within and beyond medical law, and through this work, she challenges us to consider the proper boundaries of financial trading. For example, she's written on the dilemmas of commercial surrogacy, sex work, and the sale of organs and gametes. Why are certain financial transactions deemed off limits, despite there being willing buyers and sellers? How can and how should we regulate these exchanges? Her work also tackles issues related to race and gender in financial markets and corporate governance. And recently, she's been examining non-financial incentives for organ donation, such as kidney swaps, incompatible donor chains, and transplant priority system. Rounding out her career, she's also spent time in legal practice, notably as part of the Commodity and Derivatives Group at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York. So just before I hand over to our speaker, a few logistics. The lecture is being recorded and live streamed for those joining remotely. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A session until approximately 6:15 p.m. when you're all invited to a drinks reception out in the foyer. Our online audience members can submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And with that, I think you'll agree that we have a really terrific talk in front of us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kim Krawiec.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and for having me and for the invitation and for this weather. I really, really appreciate that. It's far preferable to what I landed to over the weekend when it was cold, at least by my standards. Okay, so the topic of the talk today is repugnant transactions and taboo trades. And, oops. Let me make sure that I'm on the same page as you. Okay, so just to talk to you about what my goals are during the time we have together tonight. First of all, I want to define what is a repugnant transaction or taboo trade in case you were saying to yourself, what the heck is this talk about? That will be first on the agenda. I want to talk about some examples. I'm particularly going to spend some time on three examples that have important policy implications: plasma, transplantable organs, and blood. Most of my work, as was mentioned during the introduction, is on transplantable organs, in particular kidney exchange. And so I'll spend most of my time talking about that. I am going to talk about plasma, and I'll talk about that first for a variety of reasons that I'll emphasize when I get to that section. We have lots of evidence about plasma. We have decades of research and real world evidence on it. I just wrote a paper about this, so I want to talk about that. And in particular, it has current implications in the UK. And so, when in Rome, at least talk about Rome, right? And so that's what I'm going to do. All right, and then finally, I am also going to make some policy recommendations here and there, point out what I think are some misguided efforts. So, what is a repugnant transaction or taboo trade? Now, in theory, it could be anything that others find offensive or upsetting for any reason. But I'm sure we can all agree that that is not a very useful definition. It is not the one that we are going to use tonight. Instead, within recent years, a lot of literature has focused on transactions that are considered unobjectionable, perhaps even laudable or praiseworthy when they're done for free, but that are considered corrupted when they're done for money. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Michael Sandel's best-selling book, What Money Can't Buy. You may be less familiar with two of the researchers whose work I am building on in my discussion tonight. The economist, Al Roth, a market designer, and Phil Tetlock, a psychologist. And part of the title for the talk is that Al tends to use the phrase repugnant transactions, and Phil tends to use the phrase taboo trades. And now I'm encompassing both as best I can. And Phil has written extensively about these topics, both alone and with Alan Fisk. And I'll be building on some of that. So, just to give you a few examples before I sort of launch into the main topics that I want to focus on for tonight. Um, Prostitution, a common example that is mentioned in this genre of taboo trade, right? Most countries do not prohibit, some countries do, of course, but most countries don't prohibit um, sex between consenting adults, even promiscuous sex, right? Many of those same countries, however, will prohibit sex for money, right? So the paid version of the good is more regulated, more disfavored, and considered corrupted by many. Other examples, organs. Unless you can donate your kidney, you will perhaps be considered a hero for doing so. But unless you're in Iran, you can't sell it to somebody. You can carry a baby for your infertile sister out of altruism, but in many countries, you can't do it for pay. In some countries, you can. Okay, so the examples, as I said, that I want to focus on: plasma, organs, and blood. And I want to talk about them through the twin principles of the World Health Organization's uh, principles on blood and organ, non remuneration, and self sufficiency. As all of you probably are aware, World Health Organization is not itself a rulemaking body. Its recommendations are influential, though. But importantly, these two twin principles that I'm going to talk about are embodied in various rules and regulations at the country level around the world. And I'm going to talk about some of those today. Now, there's been a lot of talk about non remuneration, and I am going to talk about that today. But one of the things that I want to focus on is self sufficiency. I think it gets talked about less. And in particular, the tension between non remuneration and self sufficiency is not discussed frequently. It is important, as I'm going to show you, particularly when it comes to plasma. And the implications are quite stark there. So, as I said, I want to talk about plasma in part because I think we have lots of evidence over a number of decades about the interaction of remuneration and self sufficiency when it comes to plasma. And as I said, there's particular relevance here in the UK, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So what is plasma? Now, first of all, I know that many of you are medical experts yourselves. I'm going to pretend like you don't know what plasma or blood or organ transplantation is, even though I know that many of you are experts in at least one of those things. So apologies if I'm repeating things that you know. I'm going to talk to the one person out there who doesn't know. So plasma is the liquid portion of blood that carries red and white cells, platelets, and vital proteins. There are many uses for plasma, but the biggest use by far, and only one that I am talking about tonight is the use of plasma to make plasma-derived medicinal products, PDMPs. Many of these PDMPs are life-saving treatments with no substitutes. Some of them are classified as essential drugs by the World Health Organization for that reason, and they are also unavailable to much of the world's population for reasons that I'm going to talk about. So, many of you may be familiar with the particular relevance of plasma here in the UK. In 1998, the UK instituted a ban on the domestic manufacture of PDMPs because of fears over VCJD, mad cow disease, essentially. Okay. And so recently, though, in 2021, that ban was lifted, and it's led to lovely headlines like the ones you see here, right? Plasma collection and manufacture and distribution has again started. This is just from last week. NHS patients are now receiving life-saving medicines made from the blood plasma of UK donors for the first time in 25 years after a long-standing ban was lifted. Okay, so this does lead to the question, right? What happened between 1998 and 2021? What did you do? Well, you did the same thing when I say you, I mean the UK, did the same thing that most countries around the world do, which is to import it, mostly from the United States, but not exclusively so. Okay, so this is the NHS projections of self-sufficiency going forward. As you can see, I think they're quite conservative. These are, although it's unlikely that these 2025 marks have been hit. We can talk about that during the Q&A if you would like. But even in 2031, there's only projected a roughly 30% self-sufficiency on immunoglobulin in particular. And I don't know whether you will or won't meet that, but I do feel confident in saying that under current law and policy, the UK will not be self-sufficient in plasma. And that is because current law prohibits paying plasma donors in the UK. And when it comes to plasma, there is definitely no free lunch. Nobody gets plasma for free. There is no country in the world that is self-sufficient in plasma production for PDMPs that fails to pay donors. In fact, the way I like to think of it is that every country, in fact, pays donors, either directly, because you pay your own donors, or indirectly, because you're importing from countries that do pay donors. Again, principally the United States, which supplies over 70% of the world's plasma, but we are not the only people to be compensating plasma donors. In fact, so just to illustrate this point a little bit more, this is fairly recent data, the most recent data that was available at the time I put together this presentation for the EU. And as you can see here, right, the only countries that are self-sufficient in the domestic production of plasma, in other words, the only ones that are at 100% self-sufficiency, are also the countries that make monetary payments to donors. Right. And so this isn't things like the Italians might give a day off work or these other things, right? It's actual cash payments to donors. Um, this, by the way, is from Julio Elias in BMJ Global Health from 2024. The data, though, is directly from the EU. Peter Jaworski uh, collected similar data for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the US. And you can see a similar phenomenon. No surprise here, the UK at 0% during this time period. That's to be expected because the ban was in effect. What I find interesting, though, are Canada and Australia, who are not becoming more self-sufficient in plasma. They're actually becoming less self-sufficient in plasma, right? Their self-sufficiency percentages are going down. New Zealand is remaining relatively stable and at what looks like a high level of self-sufficiency. We can talk about this in the Q&A. New Zealand doesn't currently use as many PDMPs as other countries, and that's expected to change. So this number is probably going to change going forward. Okay, so why is this? Now, partly this is a matter of cost. Counterintuitively, it is more expensive to collect plasma for manufacture from altruistic donors than it is from paid donors, right? So this is not a cost-saving measure for these countries. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Altruistic donors have to be recruited and retained, and once they're recruited and retained, they donate less often and less reliably than paid donors, while fixed cost remains relatively stable, right? So for example, the economist Bob Slonim calculated that in Australia, the domestic supply of immunoglobulin costs over 3 times more per unit than what's imported, despite domestic donors not being compensated. Jaworski has updated those numbers up through 2022, and you can see that the differential has narrowed. Australia has become more efficient and better at a domestic unpaid plasma collection, but it is still more expensive than paid plasma collection that they import, right? So it's still a money loser in that sense. Okay, so how do the twin principles relate to that? Let's return to the twin principles that I said I was going to start with. So, first of all, wealthy countries that don't pay donors, right? And with a very valid excuse, right? We are compliant with the most recent international advisories, right? This is what is recommended. They fail to add to the global supply, right? Leaving the United States and a handful of other countries that are paying donors to pick that up. But even worse, and I think far more serious, is that these purchases reduce the supply that is available to low and middle income countries and drive up the price. And that is one reason that you see graphs like this, right? This is PDMP use by region. North America, of course, eating up the lion's share of it. The US uses a lot. Canada also uses a lot, I should say. Europe here at about 18.5%. Asia and the Pacific, I'm going to return to this in a minute, at 25%. And here, right, Africa and Latin America at very, very small numbers, right? Very unlikely to be able to afford plasma. We can talk about this in the Q&A. I know more about Africa, I think, than about Latin America in terms of their plasma collection. But even the small amounts that are domestically collected there they're all plasma that is derived from whole blood collection and then separated, and most of it is wasted for a variety of reasons, including lack of storage, lack of testing, sort of all the things that you might expect. So this problem is not going to reduce in the coming years. In fact, PDMP use is expected to grow. There are new uses being found for it all the time. And so you can see here the global market is expected to expand by just over 7%. Sorry, it did expand over 7% from 2019 to 2022. That is expected to either stay the same or even accelerate. And in particular, that is because Asia is expected to use far more PDMP than is currently the case. And that is going to add to the demand and presumably affect the price. Okay. All of these charts, by the way, I'll try to, without bogging you down, show you the sources for where I'm getting things. This is from an April 2024 presentation in Rome, Italy by Patrick Robert. Okay, so I said I would make recommendations. What are the recommendations? First of all, rather than self-sufficiency and non-remuneration, what we should be encouraging is donor pay by wealthy countries and trade to low and middle income countries. And in fact, encouraging the use of foreign aid or facilitating the use of foreign aid by low and middle income countries to purchase plasma. They don't have enough. We're collecting a lot. Acknowledge that paid plasma is safe. It's actually incredibly frustrating to hear the same countries that are importing large amounts of plasma collected from paid donors say that they don't pay donors because they fear that paid plasma is unsafe. If that's the case, stop importing it, okay? So everybody knows that paid plasma is safe. And wealthy countries know this, or they wouldn't have been importing it for decades now, right? So though that's my stump speech. plasma. I'm going to talk now about organs, which is actually where I spend most of my time, what I spend most of my time working on. I am going to talk about non-remuneration. After all, it's a talk on taboo trades. What would it be if I didn't do that? But again, I'm going to focus on self-sufficiency and in particular on international cooperation. Self-sufficiency is not what is needed here. International cooperation and much more of it is what is needed here. And why do I say that? Kidney matching, and most of the activity and need for organs is in the kidney space. And kidney matching and exchange depends on a large pool of potential donors in order to really be effective. And all countries can benefit from international cooperation, but it is especially smaller countries and countries without robust kidney exchange programs who can benefit the most, right? And so we should not be preaching self-sufficiency to these countries. We should instead be facilitating international cooperation among these countries. Now, I'm going to use an example. I'm going to give you two examples. I'm going to start out with the example of US and Denmark. Denmark, a wealthy country with a robust transplant system, but a small country, right? And so you can see, even in this example between the US and Denmark, the effects. So we can start with just a population comparison. I realize the scale is very distracting here, but it is what it is. The US population is approximately 50 times larger than Denmark's, right? Much larger. But of even more relevance is that the number of deceased donors is about 100 times that in Denmark. So in 2020, the US had 12,588 deceased donors, roughly 100 times Denmark's 124 donors. And both countries perform living and deceased donor transplant, but the scale is much, much more in the US, as you would expect, right? So compare Denmark's 200 deceased transplants, kidney transplants, and their 78 living kidney transplants in 2020 versus 18,410 in the US and 5,234. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, there are, and I'm going to explain this in more detail in the slides that are coming up. There are a number of people out there in the world who are difficult to match for a variety of reasons, right? They have antibodies against most of the population. These people can find it very difficult to find a match, especially when they are in a very small donor pool. And that's why so for these people, it benefits everybody, but it especially benefits those people, right? A very difficult to match patient would have a 100 times greater chance of finding a match in the US deceased donor pool than they would in the Danish one. So international kidney exchange could make this a win-win situation for everybody. So I'll just back up a little bit and talk to you about what kidney exchange is, because then I'm going to show you a couple of examples, simple and complicated. It's not complicated, but simple and less simple. Okay. So in its simplest form, kidney exchange, kidney paired donation is just a swap, right? So let's suppose that we have this couple here on the top. Recipient 1 is in need of a kidney. Her husband is willing to donate a kidney to her, but they're incompatible. He's not able to do so. Perhaps he is the wrong blood type. Perhaps she has antibodies that are specific to him. Perhaps she developed those during gestation and childbirth of his children, which is not uncommon. So for whatever reason, he can't donate to her. Right? Let's assume that this next pair below them is in the same situation. Right? If it turns out, right, that we're lucky and donor 1 is compatible with recipient 2 and donor 2 is compatible with recipient 1, then they can just swap places, right? Rather than donating to his wife, donor 1 will donate to recipient 2. Rather than donating to her partner, donor 2 will donate to recipient 1. Everybody's happy. Everybody's better off, right? That's the simplest form. There are some impediments to that type of simple swap that we can talk about that have led people towards what are referred to as need chains, never-ending altruistic donor chains. They work just like the example we were just talking about, right? So each of the pairs here are just like the ones I just showed you, right? Donor 1 is willing to donate to recipient 1, but is not able to do so. Donor 2 is willing to donate to recipient 2, but not able to do so, so on and so on and so on. Okay, so what happens here is that it operates the same, except that we're inserting a non-directed donor at the beginning of the process. A non-directed donor, this is an altruist who just comes forward and says, I don't have anybody in particular that needs my kidney. I just want to do the most good that I can. I'm willing to give it to anybody, right? Now we can have this altruist, this non-directed donor, can donate to recipient 1. Then donor 1, right, the paired donor, can donate to recipient 2. Then donor 2 can donate to recipient 3, and so on and so on and so on. In theory, this can go on forever. As a practical matter, typically it ends with a donation to the waiting list or to somebody who doesn't have a paired donor, right? So typically it doesn't go on forever, but you'll frequently, I mean, that's why it's called never ending, right? You'll frequently see people say, it can go forever. And theoretically it can. All right. Let's return to our incompatible Danish pair. How does this relate to them? Well, rather than self-sufficiency, that's just dumb in this situation, right? The incompatible Danish pair could travel to the US for a kidney transplant. Recall that gives her a much, much higher chance, roughly 100 times better chance of finding a compatible donor. She can receive a compatible deceased donor kidney from the pool. And now, recall, her husband, who was willing to donate to her but unable to, can start a kidney chain. He becomes the altruistic donor in this, donating to the first person, and now it proceeds on and on and on, just exactly like that other chart that I showed you, right? In other words, the result here, a Danish recipient who could not find a transplant in her home country, and presumably not otherwise conveniently either, right? Otherwise, this would be perhaps trouble for her to go to, gets a transplant that she couldn't otherwise get. And the US wins here as well, right? The US deceased donor kidney is replaced by a better quality living donor kidney that can set off a chain that can transplant a lot of people. Everybody should win in this situation. And that's what we should be striving for, not self-sufficiency. This can help people. Okay. Let me give you another example that involves the United Arab Emirates and Israel. So the UAE, as some background, has excellent hospitals, performs kidney exchange, has lots of international transport, big airport hubs, which are important, and has public medical care that includes dialysis and transplantation. Abu Dhabi and probably all of the UAE also has high rates of renal disease, possibly due to heat and outdoor work, but in any event, they have high rates of renal disease. The problem is that there is a resident population of only 10 million, right? Making, again, a match hard to find for people who are difficult to match. All of this led in the summer of 2021 to a three-way swap among 3 difficult to match pairs, all involving mothers. Again, just to emphasize the possibility of developing antibodies to your family members during gestation and childbirth. So the swap involved a mother-daughter pair, um, Arab residents of Abu Dhabi, a husband and wife Arab-Israeli pair, and a mother-daughter is Jewish-Israeli pair. All right, so those are the 3 pairs involved. And the daughter from the UAE donated her kidney to the Arab-Israeli wife. Her husband then donated to the mother, right, the Jewish-Israeli mother. And then that daughter donated back again to the UAE to the mother, right? Again, a win-win for everybody. And as you might imagine, right, although the political situation was easier in 2021, it still was not easy, right? There was a lot of diplomacy involved. Here are some photos from the exchange you can see, and I can give you any number of examples. I'm going to actually give you a citation to a paper at the end of the talk if you want more examples. I have a number of them, But the point is that they're, if not one-offs, they're irregular operations, right? Again, the talk is of self-sufficiency. The talk is of improving your domestic infrastructure, your domestic collection, your domestic process. All of that is important. I would not deny that that is important. But this should be a regular part of operations, right? The WHO, governments, the transplant community, all should be encouraging this instead of self-sufficiency, and should be helping provide infrastructure to do so. Okay, I said I would talk about organs and remuneration. What would it be? A repugnant transaction if I didn't talk about remuneration. So I will do that now. Only Iran has a legalized organ market. So in the following conversation about things that are incentives to donate, none of them, in my view, I think, approach what you or I would typically think of as a market. There are more things like tax deductions, sick leave, in some cases, funeral expenses. You may or may not consider that a market, but it's not sort of like an actual functioning market like Iran has. Okay. Even though within this limited space of what we're talking about, there is vast disagreement about what counts as remuneration. There are legal and cultural differences, some of which I'll talk about. And importantly, the discourse around this is really alarmist and unhelpful. I'm going to give you some examples. Is not every attempt to incentivize organ donation is organ trafficking. You may think it's wrong, you may think it's a bad idea, and that is fine. But I think it's not helpful and not productive to label everything as organ trafficking. Instead, what is really called for here is respectful discussion, ethical experimentation, and an open debate. So I'll start with an example from the United States. Of course, the laws that I know best are US law. The National Organ Transplant Act in the United States prohibits valuable consideration, in quotes. That term is not defined in the statute. A later statute, the Norwood Act, specifies that kidney exchange, as we've just been talking about, the exchange of a kidney for a kidney, is not valuable consideration. And that's despite the fact that it's obviously value to trade a kidney that you can't use for one that you can use, right? That's why this act was passed, because some people said, isn't that valuable consideration, right? But according to statute, that is not valuable consideration. Much of the world does not agree with that, right? There are many countries that don't allow kidney exchange, and there are for a variety of reasons, including concerns that this is sort of one step towards commercialization or something, right? Including other reasons. Germany, Brazil, there are a number of countries that don't permit kidney exchange and that are having robust discussions about whether or not that should change currently. Financial incentives. I'm putting this in quotes, and the reason I got it in scare quotes is because whether or not the things that I am talking about are actually an incentive versus the removal of a disincentive to donate is itself a topic of robust discussion, right? So some people don't like, so there are some people who say this is not an incentive, right? That would encourage people to donate. What we're doing is just making people whole. I'm not, I mean, I think it can be helpful, but in any event, the goal is to have people donate. I'm going to call them incentives for now, but just know that some people would object to that terminology for these specific examples and would say that it's actually a removal of disincentives. So some common types of financial quote unquote incentives, so again, starting with the US, tax deductions, a common one for us. Tax credits, which in the US are only at the state level now, and only I think in 2 states. There is a proposal at the federal level. I don't know if it will pass. Sick leave guarantees. Israel has what I think is the most generous program of anyone, prioritization on the deceased donor waiting list of registered donors, as well as some family members of deceased donors, a comprehensive financial aid package that includes 40 days of lost wage reimbursement and 7 days in a recuperation facility. That's the most recent change, which is even more generous than what they had before. And then finally, funeral benefits. So funeral benefits would be if you go to a deceased person's family and say, "Can you consider you're not listed? Your deceased loved one was not listed as a registered donor. Would you consider donating? And in exchange, we can help with funeral arrangements. We can help with funeral costs. That's what. So, and it varies from proposal to proposal and country to country, but that's sort of what's envisioned. Some countries provide this. In the United States, the state of Pennsylvania at one point wanted to introduce funeral benefits, and it was determined that they could not do that because federal law prohibited that, the National Organ Transplant Act, with the undefined concept of valuable consideration. And so that was dropped, right? So we don't have something like that in the United States. The most recent example is China. As some people may be aware, China once obtained most of its organs from executed prisoners. They resolved to stop that in 2015 and have since then worked towards a more ethical, regulated system. And people will, of course, disagree on how much progress they've made there. The numbers are still low by international standards, but a big, big improvement over what they were in 2015, right? So I just want to acknowledge that. In part, some of that success is attributed to the fact that the Chinese Red Cross provides funeral benefits, quote, to recognize specific aspects of the Chinese culture. It's not clear what those are, but I assume it has to do with reciprocal gift giving, with you are taking care of us, so we are taking care of you, something along those lines, right? Critics, of course, point to the WHO policies on non-remuneration, and in fact, even go so far as to label this organ trafficking and crimes against humanity, right? Because that's what organ trafficking is. And so, whether you agree or disagree with the Chinese, what I hope I can at least convince you of is that it's not productive to label it organ trafficking. That is a whole different thing. And we can have a debate about whether this is a good or a bad policy without going there. Okay. So in the concluding minutes, I'm going to talk about whole blood, and I have less to say about whole blood. I'm sorry. It's also not as exciting. Um, at least what the recommendations I have, and I'll tell you why. You'll see when I sort of go forward in the slides. I'm very cautious. I think caution is really warranted with whole blood. It's not processed at the same level as plasma, and so as a result, we really do have to care about safety much more when it comes to blood for transfusion. So this is from the American Red Cross. Whole blood is used to treat patients who need all the components of blood, such as those who have sustained significant blood loss due to trauma or surgery. Okay, so the WHO does periodic surveys. In their last survey, 79 countries reported that they collect over 90% of their whole blood supply from what are referred to as voluntary non-remunerated blood donors, VNRBDs. And that's what you have here. That's what every wealthy country has, right? People who, like at work or at church or wherever they are, donate blood. It doesn't take that long. You get a cookie and maybe some coffee, and that's it, right? Um, However, 54 countries collect over 50% of their whole blood supply from replacement or family or paid donors. Now, at first blush, it doesn't sound like a bad thing to use family donors necessarily or replacement donors. But the problem is that it is very common in these places to substitute what are actually paid donors who pose as a friend or family member. And in the moment, that can be something that's difficult to verify, and maybe people don't want to verify it that much. I don't know. But the concern, I think warranted concern, is that this contributes and leads to black markets. So these 54 countries collecting 50% of their blood supply from that type of donor is a cause of concern. And here there is a very, very vast divide between wealthy countries and poor countries, low and middle income countries, right? Wealthy countries really collect enough blood. This is in part, people are generous. We mostly have relatively low levels of bloodborne illness. Um, and um, um, and we don't use that much whole blood anymore, right? Innovations in surgery, reduction in traffic accidents, better maternal care, all of these things contribute to a lower need for whole blood. That is not the case in low and middle income countries. Many low and middle income countries cannot satisfy their whole blood needs through voluntary non remunerated blood donors, and also correspondingly need more whole blood, right? And the result, especially in sub Saharan Africa, is that shortages of whole blood contribute to maternal death, death from traffic accidents, and complications from childhood anemia. Um, okay, so again, as I said, the recommendations here are really quite cautious. And the reason for that is, again, that whole blood does undergo less processing than plasma. Safety is paramount. But I will say it is important to rely on the latest research rather than decades old assumptions. Many of you are probably familiar with titmus. It gets invoked all the time. That was a long time ago, before modern day testing facilities, before modern day regulation, um, and didn't use field research, right? There has been actually a fair amount of more recent, rigorous field-based research finding that small incentives, right? We're talking $15, $20 gift cards here. There's not a lot of money. Increase supply safely. They're offered for showing up, not for donating. So there's no incentive to lie, right? You receive the gift card regardless of whether your blood is used. And most well-off countries already use these mechanisms. The US uses gift cards regularly. We used them even more during COVID because that was one of the times where there was problem with the blood supply because people were staying at home. A number of countries offer paid work leave and other types of again, what are considered small incentives that don't compromise safety. So I'll just direct you then to this conclusion from Lecture, Machis, and Slonim in Science magazine. In light of the recent evidence, it is time to re-examine policy guidelines for increasing and smoothing blood supply, including whether incentives can play a role. Some WHO guidelines, for example, an emphasis on the exclusive use of non-remunerated donors and centralizing blood collection organizations, are unintentionally adversely affecting blood collection in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so what's my conclusion? You can probably already guess most of them. First of all, trade and cooperation are good. Somebody should tell Donald Trump that. Um, Honesty is also good. You could tell him that too, I suppose. Non-remuneration and self-sufficiency do not work when it comes to plasma. Everybody knows this, right? There's no point in pretending otherwise. For all of the other things that I've talked about, there is some evidence and more is certainly needed, but we should be using that latest evidence, referring to it, and expanding on it, not just referencing sort of old platitudes. We should experiment. Experimentation is good. That allows us not only to find out what works, but what's ethical, right? Do people really view this as more corrupted now that they're being offered a $15 gift card? We don't know unless we offer somebody a $15 gift card, right? And then finally, debate. Everybody who disagrees with you is not a criminal and not an organ trafficker. Okay. And I think that's it. If you are just dying to learn more about all of these things we've talked about today, I have a recent paper with Al Roth. WHO says countries should be self-sufficient in unremunerated organs and blood. You can find it on SSRN. And another relatively recent paper, again with Al, Ignacio Marino, and Mike Reese, Criminal, Legal, and Ethical Kidney Donation and Transplantation, a conceptual framework to enable innovation. And I will take your questions.